Hello, this is Austin Wintory. I have the immense pleasure of once again joining you on the Game Maker's Notebook, and today I am interviewing a great friend and extraordinary composer, Wilbert Roget. He's known recently for scores to Mortal Kombat 11, the World War II return to the Call of Duty franchise, and a bunch others. We get into that, into his background, a surprisingly deep kind of existential philosophical debate of sorts, and to my immense enjoyment, he corrects me on things constantly, or so it felt. And if it's not obvious, I actually do enjoy, genuinely, being told when I'm wrong. And so I hope you enjoy. Here it is.
Welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook, a podcast featuring a series of in-depth one-on-one conversations between game makers providing a thoughtful, intimate perspective on the business and craft of interactive entertainment. The Game Maker's Notebook is presented by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a member-driven organization dedicated to the recognition and advancement of interactive entertainment.
I'm here with the one and only Wilbert Roget, the second Esquire, Lord and Commandant.
So not only is there another one, my dad, because I'm the second, but my name is actually Wilbert with a T at the end.
I said it. It's Wilbert. I was here.
But that's why I just go by Will.
Here's why I was. Here I am trying to sound like a worldly, sophisticated person, and you're like, nope, Wilbert.
It's all good.
Will Roget. See, now that's confusing. It's not Roget.
It's French.
So it should be Wilbert.
Wilbert.
All right.
Ça serait la prononciation.
This is going to be all in French.
What?
Mine's going to be like a deep fake replacement into French done through Google Translate, which is going to be wildly inaccurate.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so composer extraordinaire. Let's start with the obvious, because people listening cannot see right now that there's three of us. There's a bear on the couch next to you. And as someone who has fallen under the charm spell on Instagram and stuff of your bear, I have been very eager and waiting for this opportunity to ask you, what the hell is the story with the bear? I need to know more about the bear.
He's my little brother. He's like 15 years old. His name's Connor.
A little tattered Coke polar bear?
Yeah, I got him at the Coca-Cola Museum in Atlanta.
Ha! There you go. 15 years ago.
15 years ago, junior year of college. Yeah.
It's a great little sort of social media thing of like, here we are printing stems, or here we are reviewing scores, and it's always just the bear like doing everything on your behalf.
He does most of the work in my studio.
I gather. Connor
Bear, yeah.
Is this a like Terminator bear?
I honestly don't know why that's his name. It just kind of, for some reason, Connor Bear. I don't know.
I love it. Well, I was expecting a 30-minute story, so I've grossly under-budgeted for this podcast. Yeah. Well, good to know. We will definitely make sure that this ends up in the photos, the Connor Bear. So I always like to kind of start at the beginning. In your case, it's especially sort of sentimental for me, because I'm pretty sure we met at what was my first GDC, and I feel like it was your first GDC also, or one of your first.
Yeah, like 2007 in SF GDC?
Yeah, it was 2006 or 7.
Yeah.
Because I'll distinctly remember, for those who don't know, in the audio track at GDC, they do a thing called the Demo Derby, which is where a room full of bright-eyed, terrified, hopeful young composers submit their music to be judged by this kind of America's Got Talent style jury of luminaries in the business, and it'll be, and careers have been launched in that room, because it will be like the head of music for Sony, or, the music supervisor at EA or whatever. It's not just veteran composers, but it's often people in a hiring position giving feedback on demos. And if you really blow them away, hypothetically, they may say, what do you got going on next summer or whatever, afterward. And so, but it's also just a chance to get feedback and hear how you stack up, and also in a very public way where you're hearing everybody else's stuff. And I remember I went in there I was quite nervous, and it was the classic In the Spirit of the Bear. I was probably more afraid of everyone. They were more afraid of me than I was of them, but I was quite terrified. And I will never forget the impact your piece had, because I remember asking you, where'd you record that? And you said, that's all samples. And I thought, that's not possible. It was the best mock-up I'd ever heard. And it was so, I think part of why it was so convincing was that it was so musically arresting. Like, it was real writing. And so much of those are like people that, you know, they're not quite ready for prime time because their music's a little underdeveloped, or they don't really know how to use the technology. And that was so thoroughly not the case with your stuff. So that was my introduction to who you are, is just being blown away and immediately shitting myself going, okay, well, that guy's, I got to worry about that guy. You know, like,
well, you know, it's funny, like on that subject, and I'm sorry to get a little nerdy for like just right off the bat, but like I've never liked the idea of composing to the samples. And that's something that it's one of those like institutional knowledge things that you'll hear from so many people. And I understand why they do it. But it's never really been the way I wanted to work. And the reason why is because I started off with like, you know, general MIDI and this stuff that sounded objectively terrible. So there was no point to composing to the samples because number one,
that wasn't even a thing.
Number one, it sounded awful. And number two, it's going to sound different on everyone's machine anyway.
Right.
So you'd focus instead on like, well, what should it sound like? And then you kind of think of every instrument as an actual human being that's going to play this. And maybe the second bassoon should actually have fun playing instead of, you know, not wondering why did I even show up to work today, you know, that kind of thing.
I know that's sort of wading into the weeds, but that's such a good composer sort of pearl of wisdom that you look at, there's half the orchestra sort of has none of the glory, you know, there's the violinists, there's the French horns, you know, there's a few others, flutes probably, but the vast majority have to typically be in deference to the rest. And it's like you just said, if the second bassoon is happy, if the fifth desk of violas is happy, you probably wrote a killer piece. And even if you didn't write a killer piece, they will play it as though you did. Yeah. Because they're like, this is fun. This is real music for a change. Like, because they're used to two alternating realities. They do classical music where they're playing Beethoven and Stravinsky and whatever else, where they are getting that workout, but they're also probably bored because they've played it so much. So then they do sessions where, it's a new challenge. Every day is a new adventure. We're sight reading, blah, 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 blah. But then it's all whole notes that's boring and they hate it. And so I guess what I'm saying is that they'll complain about all scenarios, but no, we love our musician community very much.
And it keeps them engaged. I mean, if you dissect any John Williams score for 10 minutes, you will find something interesting going on almost everywhere. I mean, he's actually more economical, I think, than people realize. When you hear it, it sounds like the gestalt of like a million things going on. Then once you kind of zero in, you realize, well, actually, it's simpler than what I thought it was, but it's different than what I thought it was as well. There's a lot of surprises under the hood.
His music never fails to blow my mind in that way. It's so overwhelming to listen to. He engages every single musician in the orchestra. So you're hearing 100 bodies doing stuff, vibrating. And it just seems like it's going to be this solid black ink page of madness, you know? Because you look at like The Rite of Spring, it really is like that. I mean, there's just so much going on. And you figure, like random 2M7 version 3 of Empire Strikes Back, or some, you know, little innocuous cue, not that there's an Empire Strikes Back, is going to be, you know, just like a whole note for any other composer. But for him, it's overwhelming. And then you look at the page, it actually is just the whole note, but somehow he makes it come to life because he really understands. And I think you're coming from a similar place, and we're going to talk all about Star Wars eventually.
I mean, sorry for the tangent, but what I wanted to say is
it's not even a tangent because we haven't even begun. It's just the starting position. Now we will tangent.
It's always a trap. I have to warn you, it's always a trap for me to get into like the kind of nerdy stuff.
I love it.
But
no, I'm right there with you.
The reason I brought it up is that from as long as I can remember when I started working with actual professional samples, I've always sketched on paper or at least piano sketch of some kind first. So then I'm not tempted to say like, oh, let's use this articulation because it sounds great with that, you know, whatever library is hot right now or whatever. And I just kind of divorce myself from the production while I'm writing. So I'll just say on paper, like, well, I want this. And I think I remember the piece and it starts with some effect or something. And it's like, I want this sound, and I'm just writing on paper, so it's pretty easy. You just kind of do it.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's just whatever was in mind. And I'll worry, like, that's future Will's problem to figure out how it's actually going to work.
He'll be cursing me at 3 a.m. in a week, but...
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's the story of, like, everything I did on Mortal Kombat was, like, just one quote-unquote impossible thing after another. But, you know, once you have it on paper and you know it's going to work as a piece of music, then the production, in a way, becomes much easier because you have the confidence of knowing that you've, like, you know, measured twice, cut once, and then you can kind of focus in and dive deep. You can do things like editing the contact patches in some weird, bizarre ways that you would never use ever again, but for this one particular instance, it solves the problem. You can do that sort of like down the rabbit hole type stuff.
So what I love about all this is that you've kind of given us this dichotomy that I think probably a lot of non-composers would never have even been aware of, and I certainly think that's probably a lot of who ends up listening to this, people that don't necessarily know how our world works. And the idea of playing to the samples, I get as a 2-second primer on even what that is. You know, our mock-up, our ability to create these synthetic orchestral, fake demos or real demos, fake recordings of our music entails stitching together. Contact is basically a program stitching together millions of recordings of each note on their own, simulating through aggregate some kind of performance of XYZ instruments from a piano all the way up to a big giant symphony orchestra. And people don't realize how technical it can get, and the way some people realize to, like, they market these libraries as, you know, action strings for movie trailers. And so it does that sound. If you want to write the generic thing that every single trailer does and every person trying to break into that sounds like, this library, you just hit a button and it does it for you. And what I love is that you're coming at it from this much more kind of organic perspective of, I hear a sound in my head and now I look out at the landscape of the world and say, how do I make that sound? And then prior to the final version of it, how do I kind of mock that up? And it's actually a mock-up in earnest of what that means. You're trying to figure out a way to simulate it before we spend all the money with real musicians in the room.
Yeah.
And we can get into all that whole process but here's my theory. You tell me if I'm correct on this. I suspect part of why you're coming from that is that you have a strong part of your personality as a performer. I always see photos of you at MagFest with a flute in your hand, jamming at 3 a.m. in someone's hotel room. And I've always known about you from the start that performance of music is very much part of your conception of music. You're not purely, maybe nowadays, but at least at some point, and tell me to the extent I'm right or wrong here.
Well, I am a performer. I am not a good performer, but
we're not.
That's actually how I learned orchestration. It was in high school, and I'd been playing the piano for my whole life until then.
And what got you there? Let's just get a couple of these bio bullet points off the list here. Like, what got you onto the piano? Was it parents said, do this?
I was 4 years old. I was an annoying kid. They wanted to get rid of me. When you're 4 years old...
You're a piano teacher's problem now.
Yeah, your 4-year-old piano teacher is more of like a babysitter than anything else, really. But,
of course, now that piano teacher is like, that kid was my student, right? I basically am responsible for Mortal Kombat.
Sure. She's passed away a little while ago. But
in the afterlife, don't take this away from me.
But no, I mean, we had like the next door neighbors were moving out, so we got their busted Wurlitzer for $20.
Wow.
The high notes were a semitone too high, the low notes were semitone too low.
Sort of drifts.
And
that's exciting.
The keys would always get stuck, so as part of the technique, you had to play and quickly reach in and unstuck a key, and that's what I was learning on for about 10 years.
Pretty difficult to play Flight of the Bumblebee like that.
You manage. You it's a technique, it's a technique.
That's hilarious.
By the time high school,
it's very like non-caro, like prepared piano kind of mechanical device.
It's much less pleasant than that. Much less pleasant than non-caro. And that's saying a lot if you've heard a lot of non-caro.
That's true. There's our Google pause the podcast and go down the non-caro rabbit hole and then resume.
I was just listening to this great, I forget exactly what it was called, but it was one of those like shifting timepieces where the left hand starts off slow and the right hand starts off fast. And then it kind of gradually...
So wickedly hard to play that stuff.
So hard to put that piano rolling and then just.
Well, yeah, true. No, yeah, the mechanical stuff, but
Yeah.
well, let's.
Anyway,
Again, the nerdy. This is an easy instinct for both
Austin
of us.
and I don't get to talk very often, so
I know,
it's
yeah.
like all of this stuff.
This
I'll
is
finish
just-
the story as quickly
This
as
is
possible.
us just hanging, and there happens to be microphones here.
Yeah, exactly. To finish the story,
So piano lessons.
junior year of high school, I decided, hey, I'm so jealous of all my friends who get to come into to class and they have their instruments they're carrying around and they get to play in orchestras. I want some of that action. So I just went around to all my friends that I could find and asked, hey, did you used to play something, anything in grade school, and is it sitting in your attic? And can I just borrow it for a couple of months? And so that's how I learned the flute, the clarinet, the trumpet and trombone, later on French horn in college with my roommate, and violin a tiny little bit. But the reason that I was teaching myself these instruments wasn't to actually perform on them, with the exception of the woodwinds, but it was to learn, like, well, what does it really feel like to be a trumpet player? What's it feel like to be a horn player?
What was the subtext of that interest, though? Like, were you already pursuing or interested in composing, and it was an outgrowth of that?
Yeah, I'd wanted to write for video games since like freshman year of high school. Final Fantasy VII is what convinced me.
Got it.
And I always knew I was a musician. Like I always knew this will be my career, but I didn't really know exactly what it would be until I played that game.
Was performance ever a thing? Like before composing got its teeth in? Were you thinking
throughout, elementary school, middle school, I was doing recitals and stuff, the usual kind of.
And you never considered or were intrigued by a non-musical career?
As far as I can remember, I mean, like the generic stuff when you're 10, sure,
Dinosaur hunter?
Fireman, detective, like all that. Sure, yeah, but
A fireman detective.
could I do both? Like, I think that probably is.
Yeah, isn't that like the people that figure out if it was arson or wasn't?
Yeah. This got dark, but yeah.
Well, we're in LA and it's burning down as we speak around us. So, yeah, interesting.
But yeah, and that's how I sequence as well. Everything is performed in. I don't like point and click with the mouse. Everything is not only keyboarded in.
Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. It's not as easy as some people make it seem if you want it to actually sound realistic. But I instead perform. I even practice a tiny little bit so that I can have this line actually sound like how a French horn player would play the line or how a trumpet play. I don't think that the French horn section in the however many hundreds of years of the French horn section has ever come in on time. They're always like a little bit behind, and maybe it's like they're playing on time, but the sound takes a while to develop.
I was gonna say,
I
think it's that. I think it's just that it's a slow speaking instrument.
Exactly, yeah. Or it could be that they're so antsy about their exact tuning that it's not going to go full blast until they're absolutely sure, and there's a psychological thing to it. But then on the flip side, the trumpets, if you want to make them sound realistic and it's a loud, brassy passage, guess what? They're so excited. You have to put that into the performance. It's just how they play.
Yep, it's true.
And if you just keep these sort of psychologies in mind with every single thing you sequence, then as the piece develops and all the parts come together, it should sound real. Anyway, that's sort of been my approach for as long as I can remember using.
So this was all starting to come together in high school, and
the college, I guess, is when. I mean, high school, I was still using. I went from General MIDI to DLS, which I don't even know if anyone.
I have no idea what that is.
Yeah, DLS was downloadable sounds. Do you know what sound fonts are?
Yeah.
Okay, it's like the precursor to sound fonts, basically.
Ah, interesting.
So it's like a very old sample.
It sounds like the
format.
demo scene, or something. Sounds like one of these underground internet underground culture.
It's on your computer, actually. It's
Really?
just one of those Windows buried things that not a lot of people know about. But if you're around the exact right kinds of nerds, then you find out, and you eventually.
My whole world is changing rapidly.
There's a whole subculture of this sort of thing. Yeah.
And so that became your tool, and you were already pretty aimed at games.
Yeah.
Were you ever interested in composing outside, like whether it's movies and TV, or like go write the next great opera or whatever, symphony, go produce albums or form a band, or what other kind of interests, or was it like, I love games, I play games, I want to be part of games, I love game developers, and like, I need that. Where kind of...
In high school, it was pretty much just game music because I had no experience with it growing up. I didn't have consoles or systems or anything, and I didn't have like a PC or anything like that. And then once PlayStation came around and finally this whole world, and I was like, I wanted, there's so much out there. And this was, you got to think, late 90s, I guess, which is a sort of like a golden era because so many composers who had been using, let's say, chiptune style sounds now have access to samples. So first with the Super Nintendo, and they had 8 voices, and then PlayStation, and they had 24 voices, and then they also had Redbook audio where they can just put whatever they want. They can put like a vocal song into a game, and there's just like, here you go. So it was just this explosion of creativity because no rules had been set yet. So especially in Japan, they were just doing whatever they wanted. Really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And I was just getting so much into that. Film didn't really interest me as much because I didn't really understand film music yet. It wasn't until college that I started to really understand how film music worked and really be able to it's not easy to listen to film music. I'm convinced. Like, it's very easy to watch a film and completely not notice that music is there, even for a brilliant score. It takes a while to understand when music is sneaking in, or when it's been like when and how it's subtly influencing your emotions, and being able to kind of enjoy it on that level, as well as the level where it's intended, where it's just a subconscious accompaniment.
Well, that's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down, because that's obviously kind of maybe not polarizing, but semi-polarizing subject amongst composers is, what's the perfect score, especially for a movie? Is it the one that you don't remember because it's just so transparently part of the fabric of the storytelling that you're just in the movie and you remember it was a great movie and it did its job as a silent partner, silent in quotes? Or is the perfect film score like Star Wars, where you come out of it and you're able to hum practically every cue in the whole score? And it's like, they both are. It's so dependent on the film, but it's like, this is one of those like composer wrestling championship
though
subjects.
I definitely prefer scores that are memorable and have, make bold statements and whatnot. I still stand by my statement that like you still have to learn how to listen to that. I mean, like there's a million cues in Star Wars films that if you were to start humming that to someone, then no one would have any idea what you were talking about. It still
I can tell you, I have been that guy who has hummed those things and gotten those weird looks. And I'm like, this is how I know I don't need to hang out with you. It's a nice way to filter people.
Yeah.
I could.
But you know what I mean, though? Like, even in the most memorable and like out there scores, it still is a skill to learn how to listen to them. And I didn't have that skill. Nor did I have the vocabulary of harmony and orchestration until college, where I could understand what's going on from the orchestral point of view. So, I mean, that's probably why I wasn't as interested in film scoring.
Yeah, interesting. So then by the time you go to college, is it all by that phase, like, how do I get into this business?
It was, yeah. I mean, even in high school, I was, there were all kinds of internet communities, and the indie game development world wasn't anything like it is now back then.
Yeah, it was virtually non-existent.
It really was, yeah. There was no marketplace. There was no middleware. It was very
downloadable
difficult.
was not even a thing. Like, games didn't...
You could download games and indie games and whatnot, but it was still...
Very tiny, though.
It was hard to find is the problem. There was no marketplace for it, and the whole homebrew thing was very difficult to make any kind of success in. But I did try. I did work on a ton of games actually in high school and college.
Like made by classmates or through the
just
purely
internet
online
people,
world?
completely online. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I only had really one go around with that. I worked. I used to rather obsessively play EverQuest.
Oh yeah.
In those days, and I remember meeting some folks that wanted to make their own essentially MMO, which is hilarious to think about. Like, playing EverQuest and going, I could do this. And of course, me with equivalent hubris was like, I could score that.
Yeah.
Like 16 in my parents' basement. And but I wrote I actually wrote music for these guys, and then of course the thing never got off the ground beyond like super basic prototypes.
I mean, that's a rodeo I've been down more times than I care to admit.
Yeah.
That exact same rodeo, by the way.
Yeah. But you learn so much, and you learn. I also think that there's a lot of power in learning just what it takes, even if you quote fail at like shipping it or finishing it in any sense. To me, getting a look under the hood, a lot of composers bemoan, how technology just makes it easier and easier and easier. And you have musicians, like you're obviously, you've got pretty thorough training. You've got a lot of background and experience. You've worked with live orchestras, all the whole 9 yards. And there are composers who can't, they can't read music. They operate entirely off of a laptop, keyboard and mouse style. And technology has made it so that the composers that fit that description, they can write crazy, sophisticated, brilliant stuff. And it's very technology aided, but the music still stands. And there's a whole contingent of folks out there that hate that. They're like the sort of the Luddite types that feel very threatened by how easy it is, how low the barriers to entry have gotten. There's a certain contingent. I see it a lot in the Hollywood community. There's kind of an old guard of the Hollywood film composer that thinks, if you don't know how to conduct, if you don't know how to do all those things, you don't really have what it takes, because that's the way John Williams does it. And I'm like, I don't see that at all. I would much rather live in a world where these tools enable people to dream. And yeah, of course, there's going to be 10 times more or 1,000 times more content, because now there's just shit everywhere. And most of it's going to be average or lower than that. But like, people are being creative in a way that they had no ability to before. And I think that's amazing. So that's why. I
mean, remember, I know that now I've worked with orchestras and whatnot, but I'm still just some kid from Philadelphia who found the freeware MIDI program.
But that's exactly my point. Look what that enabled.
Yeah,
that's exactly the point I'm making. Like, how cool is it that you got to, and on the development side, those early tools that let people, or like even map editors and the ability to mod games and stuff. I did a lot of that too. Like I loved the LucasArts, like Jedi Knight and stuff, and Dark Forces. Working with friends on mods for that was like the best. Creating these ludicrous maps and writing music. And so it's like, we live in a world where those tools enabled people to be creative, and we've managed to find a career in it. But for others, it's just like an outlet, and I think that's awesome. So I didn't know you had all that experience with that kind of. I shouldn't be surprised if it's nerdy and interesting. I should just assume you did it. And
the rabbit hole goes very deep.
I'm learning that quickly. So where did you go to college again?
It was Yale University.
Little indie startup in the university system, as that goes. Actually, what was that like? Because as sort of prestigious of a school it is, it's not actually particularly known in general for its music program relative to the Berkeleys, the Juilliards, et cetera, though they certainly have their claim to fame, not least of which randomly is
pretty well known for its music program, actually, for both undergrad and graduate.
I can only think, well, this is where you can educate me, because I know Marco Beltrami went there.
Yeah.
And
the Newman family.
That I didn't know.
Hindemiths taught there.
How many, which Newmans?
I think all of them.
Really?
Are
they like the trustees now of the...
someone donated like a preposterous amount of money to the Yale School of Music several years ago, like maybe 2 years after I graduated from the undergrad program. And it is now free because they donated so much money that they're like, well, we don't really have to charge tuition now.
Wow.
I don't think it was the Newman family, but that was my first thought. Also, like, who would have that much money that they would just be able to do that?
The Newmans are very associated with USC as well. Alfred Newman.
Really? Oh.
Yeah, Alfred Newman wrote their the fight song that they sing in all the football games and stuff.
Really?
And and the building, it's the Newman recital hall where every single student does their student recitals at USC. And David Newman always is there. His daughter recently graduated, I think as a vocal performance. She was there around the same time I was, and so I would see him around. And so I didn't know the Yale connection, but I remember one of my favorite composers that I discovered that you probably know about, because I believe he's also tied to Yale, but not a lot of people know about him, was Jacob Druckmann. Do you know that name? He's like a second-rate classical composer of the 20th century. He won a Pulitzer. Like, he was big in his time, but he hasn't stood the test of time. But incredibly colorful sense of orchestration. He's one of those guys where you hear a piece and you go, how did he make that sound? Yeah. And I love that guessing game when someone can figure out this alchemy of instruments. And I don't know why. One of my teachers went to Yale, Denise Hughes. If you've ever crossed paths with her, she would have been there significantly before you, but she was an orchestrator for Elliot Goldenthal and taught at NYU when I was there. And she's a Yaley. And she talked about him because I'm pretty sure he taught there. But this obviously would have been probably several decades before you were there. But in any case, so what was the reception of your interest in video game music like? Because that's always kind of a thing with composers as well.
So remember, I was there 2001 to 2005. And, as soon as I set foot on campus, I knew a couple things. One, I'm not going to learn anything whatsoever about music production here, because it was very at the time, very traditional, very art music focused, entirely art music focused. And there may have been some film stuff going on in the corner, but the film people were kind of their own separate thing. And I mean, if there's one regret I have of college, it's that I didn't it's that I wasn't brave enough to try to go there, but instead I kind of was a little bit more isolated for at least the first 3 years than I probably should have been. Because, I mean, obviously so many people come out of the School of Drama and just Yale in Hollywood is such a huge thing that there literally is a conference called Yale in Hollywood. And it's so big that there's so many, Yale and Harvard types. But anyway, I also realized that pretty much all the other students were doing really cool stuff, but it's stuff that I'd never had any experience with. They were much more about the 20th century art music side of things, which I'd never really seen. I went to a very sort of, any of the music that I had studied before was much more conservative, classical, romantic. And, Debussy was as risque as they would possibly get.
The cutting edge of the end of the 19th century.
It doesn't get, music stopped after that. There's no more. So, I had to very quickly learn about this and understand atonal music and avant-garde systems and how they work.
And like that blurry line, this is one of the things that I was exposed to that I would think is similar, is I never even considered the idea of music as also this performance art, where I end up seeing a lot of pieces where you couldn't ever really record it and capture what its point is, because it's almost a theater piece in how it's performed. And of course, these things would never have more than 10 people in the audience. But there's something stimulating about it. I don't look back on that and roll my eyes, even though so much of it is this kind of intellectual masturbation. People think they're making this ultra deep statement, and it's like, no, you just learned a cool advanced extended technique on your instrument that you want to show off. And that's cool. Roll with that. But was that because I was always a little torn? I would be fascinated, but then I'd go and listen to Jerry Goldsmith.
A friend of mine who also plays in my band, Ben Wallace, he's our lead arranger, and brilliant arranger actually, and he's also a Yale student. He had this great observation where he basically says, look, yes, we had the modernist and postmodernist eras, and there were a lot of composers who did music that maybe is unpalatable. Maybe they've gone too far. But because this composer has gone too far, now we can see that in the distance, and we can say well, what happens if we go halfway there? Or what happens if we go some of the way there? They've exposed, it's like, you're cleaning your house and then you lift up like a rock or something and then all the insects are just flying out and you're like, wow, I didn't know that was so nasty. But now you at least know, and then you're like, well, what else can we do with this? Maybe I can clean it up. That was a weird metaphor, but see where I'm going.
I got it. I here, try this one on, because I often thought of it as like Lewis and Clark. They go to the frontier and then they get all these animal pelts and drawings of weird plants and stuff, and they bring that back and say, here's all the crazy exotic shit we found on the frontier, on the edge of our known sort of culture. And we can we can bring it back with us. Not everybody is going to immediately relocate to the frontier, but little the best of what's there, or at least the most transportable, can make its way back. And I see it like that. It's and it's beyond the cliche of, if you learn super weird sound effects, you can do horror music. Like that's always the low hanging fruit people go to is, Penderecki, you're ready to score Psycho. And it's like, there's so much more than that, that's so limiting.
You get more and more shades for your palette, then it doesn't necessarily have to be, if you go to, a very avant-garde concert and you're not familiar with the avant-garde, then it probably does sound like horrifying, squeaky door music or whatever they call it. But if you are familiar with it and you do understand more or less what's going on and you've traced all the steps that have led to this piece, then you can see actually there's a very wide range of things that you can get out of it. Maybe not on an emotional level, or maybe it is on an emotional level, but there's just a lot there. It's not necessarily trying to just like, how can we make stuff sound bad? And I would almost argue that for horror scores, it's the same way. I don't think that...
Totally agree.
I don't think that even the greatest horror scores that sound so biting and dissonant and creepy, I don't think they're just trying to sound creepy. Like, I think all of the most memorable moments, there's something else going on. And I think part of the brain understands that there's something else going on. And that's part of why it doesn't just register as noise, but it's like, there's a logic to this. And that just makes it so much more terrifying that I'm hearing this, like whatever Marco Beltrami has done in his orchestration. I'm hearing something there. And it's just like, ooh, what's going on? And it's like Lovecraftian. It's like you can't understand it. And that's what makes it so compelling.
You can't understand it, but it is somehow understandable if only you knew more or you had. And so there's that. It doesn't feel random and chaotic. It's like someone's pulling the strings, and because I don't know what they're doing, it's all the more unnerving as opposed to just total randomness. I completely agree.
Yeah.
So then let's sort of wind forward then a little bit. You said you finished in what, 05, 06?
05, yeah.
And so if we met at GDC in 2006 or 7, what were those intervening years before you went there, and how were you charting your course? Because in my case, I always was really passionate about composing, but I loved it all. I loved movies, I loved TV, I loved video games. I was an avid consumer of all of those things. Like I saw a lot of movies, I played a lot of games, and I loved soundtracks. I would hear Peter McConnell, and then I would hear Jerry Goldsmith, on the same day, and I would be like, wow, both these guys are geniuses, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
The thing was, up until around that time, I mean, the truth is it was probably closer to about 2000, but if you didn't have a staff job, there was no such thing really as working in the video game industry. That around the time that we got into it is about when it became normal to be freelance. So I always thought, if I want to be a composer and dabble in everything, games are kind of out for me because I can't go get a staff job and then try to also score movies or something. So I felt like I had to kind of make a choice. I don't think I thought of this consciously, but it was one of those that I thought, a staff job is not, I don't think that's compatible with my way of life. And it probably held me back from pursuing games for a couple of years because I didn't quite realize the tides had turned from when I was a kid and I first learned all that. Knowing that that's kind of the general landscape of how things were, you were so passionate about games that you obviously you got a staff job. Like you had the best staff job in my estimation. So what was that path? You finish Yale and you're like, do you start applying to companies or what? How did
Yeah, I did. I mean, that didn't really lead anywhere because even then,
did they feel you were too uneducated?
Well, it's funny. Like a lot of
poorly credentialed.
Well, yeah. I mean, a lot of, first off, they would never have music as like an entry level thing. I mean, eventually LucasArts did, but normally, a lot of times when you had like a smaller studio and they had a composer, that composer was actually more or less the audio director.
Right.
I think the shift
all things audio.
Yeah, like the shift that happened, in my opinion, was that music used to be where the audio directors came from, but nowadays it's sound design almost every single time. So like the audio director was like, that's a promotion from audio lead, which is a promotion from sound designer, senior sound designer, usually. But at the time, it was kind of music for a while, and then it kind of sort of shifted. So that's, I think, what happened around that 2005 era. But yeah, I was applying everywhere I could see, entry level, whatever. I was also, I stayed in New Haven for a little bit, just get random jobs just to, make ends meet. And then I was trying to do more of that.
What kind? I'm just out of curiosity. What kind of odds and ends jobs?
I had a temp office thing, and then I also, one summer I was crazy busy. Like it was in the mornings was library. So I worked in the Sterling Library, like just stacking books and stuff. And then in the afternoons was the office temp job. And then I was like, dang, I need more money. Like, but no one can hire me because I'm just some college student. I'm broke. So like, what do I do? Do I get a third job at like CVS or whatever? And thankfully I didn't do that because that would have just taken up all my time.
Yeah.
That was also the summer where I decided that I suck at writing melody, like completely suck at it. So I said, okay, before you go to work in the morning, every single day, write something. So conceive of it in the shower, write it down in Finale or whatever before you go to work, and then go. And I did that for the entire.
Can we get the album? It's
so lost.
The shower tunes, the
shower melodies. Yeah,
the Will Roget shower melodies.
They were not good, but they didn't have. I mean, like the idea of like it doesn't have to be good, just has to be.
There's no such thing as not good music when you're in the shower. That's against the laws of physics. Like,
true. Yeah.
Like this, I guarantee you, this was a platinum album waiting to be unleashed.
Well, this is before I discovered the shower Post-it notes. So
yeah,
my
it's
current
true.
technique. Yeah.
Waterproof memo tools.
Yeah.
But
anyways,
As a tangent, what made you decide you suck at melody?
People telling me that I suck at melody.
Like other people at the library? Who's telling you that?
I was in a lot of online game music fan communities. And in one of them, where mostly it was about transcribing game music for like general MIDI. This is like long before MP3 was a thing. So if you wanted to hear music, you had to.
Oh, yeah.
So, we also had like a composers forum and stuff. And they knew that I had gone off to college. And my music shifted from being very clearly like, Super Nintendo, PlayStation 1 RPG focused to incorporating some of those aforementioned, 20th century techniques, minimalism, textural writing, and that kind of thing.
They liked your early stuff.
They were very conservative.
Back when you were 13.
Yeah, they were very conservative. And this is, a very difficult time in my life in terms of music because it was like, I'm not going to say that I had a support group or whatever. I was never like anyone's favorite, I'm sure. But like, suddenly people saying things like, I think that in learning, and this is an actual quote, someone told me, I think in learning all this orchestral stuff, you've forgotten what makes music fun to listen to. And that's someone telling me this, to my face. And I'm like,
was that
wow.
person a composer?
They are. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Interesting.
I'm not
we'll
sure.
Let that one hang.
Not sure what they're up to now, but like, yeah. But no,
that's a hell of a statement to make.
It is, yeah, to someone who's like trying to make it and like, you have forgotten what makes music.
It's funny that I can't help but hear that as pure projection of someone that feels self-conscious at their own, perhaps, because I always hear, a thing I run into a lot with younger composers is, do I need to learn music theory? Do I need to learn that? And there's a lot of like anxiety about what they think the required education is. And I always say, if you're making music, you're making music. There's never a bad reason to learn more. I will never hear an argument against theory and orchestration or blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, there are brilliant composers that are completely self-taught. And like, so you can't set these barriers to entry around the piece of paper you got from a certain school or something like that. But but as a result, because of that anxiety, I think there's also a projection-based rejection of it. That's like, well, I don't want to go learn theory because then it's going to ruin like my spark. And I can't help. I don't even know this person. But I have my suspicions that that's where that was coming from. It's like,
it could be. Honestly, at the
before
time,
you sold out to.
It's like I understand liking someone's earlier work more than their later whatever, and that's fine. It seems to me,
although
even
that
now,
is hilarious to think. Like, 13 versus 21-year-old Will, like.
Oh yeah.
The early stuff is a little half-baked, I suspect.
Well,
Let's find this person and do a little listening party.
We're still
Call
friends,
of
but
Duty
it's sort of like, I think that the game music conservative types are still that same way. And I respect that. That's totally fine. They don't have incredibly positive things to say about anything that we would be writing now.
Actually, I know exactly the type. I went to college with a guy that he felt that basically the mid-90s JRPG is the apex of art in all of civilization.
Yeah.
And never mind music. And that any deviation from that is not only inferior game music, he would be hesitant to even call it game music. He's like, that's just nonsense.
Yeah.
And he called me out a lot over every release for years on Facebook as like, if he thought it was remotely redeemable, it was like, well, Uematsu-san was doing this 25 years ago, so you can't really, or what I could go down that whole story.
I got a lot of friends like that. But
it's a funny thing because I don't think I know any composer that feels dismissive of the origins, and so much of the art of video game music was invented by Japanese composers in the 80s and 90s. Like that's I think the sort of the richest legacy of any one single place. So much of our kind of inherited culture comes from there, but it's also way more diverse now and like way more stylistically and aesthetically broad. And anyway, that's a funny thing that, well, I'm glad that you have handily proven that person wrong. And I can tell you, by the way, as a side note, the goddamn Mortal Kombat theme, I played that like once, and it's still with me.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And so I think that either they were wrong or your time invested in shower melodies has paid handsomely because...
I think the latter more likely.
That's great. I think that's fascinating. And I love this conscientious decision to kind of improve in a specific skill to just harken it back to that because I want to then talk about... We met at GDC and not long after that then you get hired by LucasArts, right? Like 2006, 7, somewhere around there? 2008. So that's like, of all the, at least for me, I mean, I have freaking Manny Calavera on my wall.
Yeah, I noticed. This is awesome.
And that to me that was the golden, that was what I grew, that was the LucasArts point and click adventures in particular, but I loved them all. I played, X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, and I was playing Dark Forces, and it was like the shooters. I was even playing freaking, what was it called? Rebellion, whatever their sort of galactic strategy game was.
Galactic
that was
Rebellion. Yeah.
It was very tedious,
something like that.
and I still played the shit out of that. And so it's like big LucasArts diehard junkie. So I remember when I heard that you got that job, it was one of those that I thought, I wonder if I've gone about this all wrong. Because I never even considered the idea that I could work at that place, that sacred temple of video games.
Well, I mean, remember, I wasn't really hired as a composer at all.
Still,
I was hired. So it was kind of funny. This is sort of a difficult thing for me. My first year and change working there was that I was hired as music assistant, doing a lot of music editing, taking music from the films and re-editing them to work as like in-game music loops.
It was
and
quite
for,
rare
like, cutscenes and stuff.
To commission music on a Star Wars. For the longest time, it was just all John Williams all the time.
Yeah. I mean, there were original scores here and there, but it was mostly chopping up Johnny is what Peter McConnell would call that. But yeah,
And was Jesse Harlan?
He was the supervisor.
So
the whole
did
time
he hire you more or less?
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, and this was kind of part of what made it so tricky, was that I had been coming from this, years and years of the indie world, maybe
the proto-indie world.
Yeah, before it was a thing, maybe 6 years working, no, more than that, because it's obviously after college, so almost 8 years of being the guy for music, but on a game that nobody would ever play and probably would never get finished. And now it's like, okay, now you're like below the lowest of the low in the totem pole, like under the ground somewhere, but on a game that like everyone is going to play, like Force Unleashed or some of the other ones. And it was a difficult kind of transition to sort of relearn so many different things.
How did that scale out? Because that's an interesting, like I'm like a coffee boy in the scheme of things, but on a Star Wars game. How does that stack against I am the composer, but on a little indie.
Yeah,
from New Haven.
I think even to this day, I had more confidence before the LucasArts thing than I do now. Well, yeah, now it's like I have no idea, man. I'm just trying my best. No, I mean,
I do relate to that actually.
When I was, the guy for the indie projects, then yeah, I would make decisions and I would just say, hey, this is where we're going with it, and usually developers were very happy with that. But then you get to Lucas and it's like, well, we're doing it our way. And, they were even doing things like saying like, well, you're editing music. You have to edit music in this program. Use Logic or something, which is like the worst possible program for editing of any kind. But it was like, well, what can you do? So it felt like taking a million steps back. And then the other difficult thing was that, it was a 9 to 5, not really 9 to 5, but you know what I mean, job. Yeah. Which meant that, you go home and you're so tired and you don't really want to work on anything else. You just want to sit there and, maybe play a game or go to sleep or whatever. So for a while I was very, it was just emotionally very difficult because it felt like I was being paid to stop writing music, which just felt wrong in a lot of ways. And
was the trajectory assumed or assumable?
Exactly the opposite.
So
that's
it
the
was
funny
like,
thing. Yeah,
you're not here as a composer.
Like literally, first off, I'm not going to name names, but I do know one of the other people who interviewed for it, and this person in the interview said something to the likes of, "So when do I start writing? For this?" And that's one of the things that just kind of killed their chances.
Therefore, the job went to you.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, because I was down with playing ball, but I didn't imagine myself just doing music editing forever. So I kind of like jerry-rigged and scratched and clawed my way to where I wanted it to be. Like after Force Unleashed 1, I noticed that the team really had a lot of issues with the technical side. We were relying on like level designers to implement the music because none of the audio people either had time, and Jesse really wasn't super technical, probably because he had to deal with so many game audio engines by that point that he's like, I'm not going to bother. We're just going to go to a new engine next game anyway.
Right.
So I figured, well, why don't I position myself as the tech person so that not only do we not have to rely on these external level designers with so much better, so much bigger fish to fry.
Right.
But also,
and who may not understand music.
Exactly. Yeah. We're keeping
it
it in-house as much as possible. I'm going into those design scripts, into like Lua and Python and the game tools, and doing whatever I need to do.
Did you have to learn that from the ground up?
I did.
Was your indie world?
Yeah. I took the indie thing did not help at all, but I did take some Python classes at ILM. They offered free enrichment classes there.
Wow.
So I learned how scripting works and whatnot, and so it helped quite a lot. And the other sort of unexpected upshot of that was that I started to be seen as like the technical person. And then similarly, when we switched to Unreal and WWII, for some reason I had like a 2-week head start before everyone else, because I guess whatever I was working on finished earlier or something. And so then people kept coming to me, asking me, advice on this. How do you do that? How do you do whatever? And that kind of continued until pretty much the end of LucasArts. I was seen as the more technical tech music guy. And then even for some sound design stuff, like I was temporarily like the de facto audio lead on a canceled project we had, but for about almost 6 months,
single tier,
it was pretty much. Yeah, I know. Yeah, we don't need to mention Star Wars First Assault. Google it. But like, yeah, for a while I was kind of running the shots, and then eventually we brought in Tom Bible, who was the audio director on Star Wars 1313. And we had him, unfortunately, have to manage both projects once ours kind of grew to a level where having some composer fake it for a while wasn't really quite going to cut it. And plus, I had to actually write the score, so I didn't really have the time to be doing that anyway. And eventually, we got our own audio lead. But, I kind of grew this reputation of being technical.
But this is what I love this lesson. I just saw this interview making the rounds in the last 24 hours or so of the director Christopher McQuarrie, who did the Jack Reacher film, and then subsequently the two most recent Mission Impossible films. And he was scraping by in independent film for like 20 years before he did Jack Reacher, and then bam, 2 Mission Impossible films right out of the gate that were both great. All 3 of them are great, actually. Jack Reacher I remember being like, wow, this is really fun. Werner Herzog is the bad guy. I'm so on board with this movie. And so he has this quote that I just have been seeing, that in paraphrasing, it was more or less like, don't sit around and wait for an opportunity. Just go make the thing. It doesn't matter if no one's going to see it. He was like, I made so many movies and spec scripts and short films and whatever that no one has ever seen and would never see. But that was not what they were for. And I feel like you're embodying a lot of that same principle.
It gets even more literal than that.
Okay.
Because I think 1.5 years into my being at Lucas, I overheard a conversation that I was definitely not supposed to hear. They were working on Star Wars The Old Republic, huge game, and it needed about 5 hours of original score. And originally they had 4 composers for it. But I overheard Jesse, the music supervisor, and his boss, Dara, the audio director, talking about, the deadlines are creeping up and, maybe business affairs didn't get the contracts in time or something like that. And we need a 5th composer. And they're throwing around names of people. And I'm just thinking, like, not only am I here in the building,
you're apparently in the room.
You don't have to pay me anything extra. So I may as well. I may as well. So that night I went home and I didn't know anything about the project.
I just have to know how you managed to overhear like a pretty high level.
Because they
like
were
a
just
Deus Ex up in the air vents kind of.
They were just walking by in the hallways mentioning this and stuff. And my door, I didn't even have a real like audio office. It was like just a regular office. So like, yeah, I could hear everything and I overheard that. So yeah, you can imagine like, little, 25-year-old Will or whatever on the bus ride home, just furiously scribbling in my pocketbook.
Straight to the shower for Star Wars melodies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it was funny because like, again, the game was so closely guarded that I didn't know anything about the game except like it took place like way in the past. And I wasn't even too familiar with the Jeremy Soule or Mark Griskey KOTOR scores, but I heard them a little bit from some archiving project or whatever.
But so this was a whole other level. I mean,
it's a different project.
When this game shipped, this was like one of the highest budget games ever made.
It was, yeah. So basically I went home and I just wrote a piece like then and there from what I assumed the game should sound like. And I brought it in the next day and kind of like forced Jesse to listen to it. I was like, hey, buddy, you listen to this real quick.
At which point he then realized his phones had been tapped and there was no possible way you should know this information.
So, well, long story short, yeah,
long story and several sealed court documents later.
Exactly, yeah. At first they were like, okay, well, this is actually pretty good. We didn't expect that, so yeah, let's have you write, maybe like 20 minutes of ambient music or something. And at the time I was like, yeah, that's awesome, holy crap. And then just due to the way schedules work, I kept inheriting cue after cue after cue from the other composers.
And were you having to juggle that with whatever your actual job? Like,
I was working
nights
on
and weekend cues.
Old Republic, Monkey Island 2, and Force Unleashed at the same time.
And so Monkey Island was these crazy ambitious remasters because that was its own. I remember. So Monkey Island is right there with Grim Fandango for me as like one of the gems of gaming. Mm-hmm. And that remaster was a fucking achievement. The fact that you could toggle back and forth and it would transition like on the beat.
Yeah.
Back to the original like iMuse version. It
was really hard.
I can't imagine. I was like, this is a whole they invested in this. This is a love letter if I've ever seen one. Because it was so invested and so clear. So massive props to you guys for that achievement. So the idea that you were on that, or the sequel, which I'm sure was no less daunting, and all this music editorial work, and having to write Star Wars music is not exactly, generic, low maintenance. I can dash off. I mean, I remember Gordy Hab on talking about the Star Wars Battlefront score that like he said he can do like a minute or two a day of full on action John Williams Star Wars, because it's such a complex and there's such a codified sense of kind of what's right and wrong in that world.
What
and
would
you don't
Johnny
want to
do?
What would Mr. Johnny Towner do here? And yet not just lifting. You can't just go steal from, random Return of the Jedi queue either. So how on earth were you able to juggle? Because the mental bandwidth, like you said, you come home tired. You come home after having worked a whole day, and then probably, some manner of commute home, and you're tapped out. So
it was rough. I'm not going to lie. I mean, I think that when I was working on the Old Republic, it was in a lot of different phases. So when I was working for the live orchestra stuff, I'm pretty sure that I was only doing that, if I'm not mistaken. It was just that, and then some external games stuff that I just had to do, but it wasn't like extremely demanding on my time. So it was maybe like I could spend half the day on Old Republic, and then half the day on the other stuff. Oh, you know what? It was Lego Indiana Jones, I think, or something like that. So yeah, I had a healthy amount of time to work, and it wasn't quite so bad. But the other thing that I do want to emphasize is that the Old Republic music wasn't full on Williams sound necessarily. Everyone kind of did their own interpretation or reinterpretation. Because remember, this is like 10,000 or whatever years before the original series. So it kind of had to be diverse and not precisely the Williams sound.
I always figured there had to have been some kind of fear from kind of the lords on high at Lucas that if you deviate too much, that, the Star Wars fans out there, which are
but what it was 5 composers, each kind of doing Star Wars, but we weren't necessarily doing Williams. We were just saying like, okay, here's what John Williams did, and let's focus on why he did it that way, rather than focusing on the exact details of how he writes.
That's good to hear.
And then that's what, and that was like kind of the point, because it's such an interplanetary, space opera. So we wanted the different the way the music worked, by the way, is each composer was assigned a number of planets, and then they would just have that whole planet to themselves. So that's how we were able to have the diversity.
Life right there.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
A planet all to yourself that is a desolate experience.
Well, sometimes we shared, but it was that. So it actually benefited us not to do the full Williams sound.
Yeah, to not kind of step on each other's toes.
Exactly, yeah. Whereas I think that with the modern Star Wars titles, like Battlefront, I think is much more
very
aggressively faithful. Exactly, yeah. And then what I did with Star Wars Vader Immortal was also, with some exceptions, very strongly Williams based.
Yeah.
Trying to sound like the...
I remember we did a panel together at GDC a few years ago called Composer Confessions, where the idea was to share lessons that you learned on a job or in your career that no one would have ever thought to teach in a school or at a GDC panel, the things where you hit some wall as part of the course of day-to-day business and have to solve your way through it. And your opening line, I'd love for you to recap that a little bit, because I thought it was a real highlight of that panel, because I loved where you said that when you showed up to the recording session, Lenny Moore, who he was my teacher at USC.
I remember,
and I always have admired him. And I remember thinking, this guy really knows his stuff. When I heard Outcast, I was like, this is a real composer. And I remember you said, the two of you put music out on the stage, on the stands, and you were like, Lenny's just sounded better than mine. And when I look at it, it wasn't initially obvious why the musicians just played it better. And your sort of confession was unpacking what happened there. And can you just re-summarize that? Because I remember thinking, this is a really great, because it's not a sexy subject that's going to be its own big panel or whatever, but I think all of us have had that moment of being in a rehearsal or being in a recording session and just saying, this is not clicking, and I have no idea why.
Yeah. I think I don't exactly remember the topic or too much of the content, but I do remember that idea of like, why is it that when they're playing like a Lenny Moore piece, it sounds like they've been playing this ever since high school.
Right.
It sounds like, oh yeah, this one. Whereas then I put some stuff in front of them, and then they're like very hesitant and they're like kind of, then the person 10 desks back is clearly faking it a little bit. It just didn't. It sounded like they were very apprehensive. I do remember that the title, for some reason, was called "Musicians Are People Too," and I don't.
Well, that was exactly. To me, that was your epiphany. I love that. I remember it better than you did. I'm a much better student.
Apparently,
what I recall your epiphany being was essentially what we were talking about at the beginning of you. By visualizing the musicians, every single one of them, down to the 8th viola. Violas always get to be the sort of ambassador to the forgotten underclass. We'll just keep invoking violas.
I love violas, though.
Me too.
They sound awesome.
It is, but it's funny how they're just always the forgotten ones. But you were like picturing it as a person playing these notes makes you want to not bore them. And so you inject interest into every single part, and then they have to lean forward and play because it's you have to straddle that line. If it's too hard, then they're just going to struggle and it's going to fall apart, or they're going to turn against you because they think this guy's got something to prove and he's just being hard because he's an asshole.
Yeah.
But if it's too easy, they'll be bored. So it's like the classic sort of flow theory dynamic in between where you're making them engage just enough that they actually get excited, but they're not overwhelmed and frustrated. And that to me was the takeaway of your thing. And that you had talked about, it was the Old Republic where you really experienced, I think it was the Old Republic.
It was,
where recording that score was like this huge turning point in your sort of awareness of how to do this.
And I got this sense of, like, I won't necessarily say, hey, if I can't play it, then I'm not going to ask someone else to play. Because obviously I'm not going to play a violin line as well as
hypothetically there are better violinists out there.
Obviously, because I don't play the instrument at all. But it was more like, hey, understand and maybe, read some of the literature, maybe read some etudes, understand what they can play without even thinking because they've been doing it for a million years.
Right. And
kind of gravitate towards that and try to write music that's engaging and makes them feel like they're totally badass.
Yeah.
And your job, honestly, if you think about it, the composer's job is to make musicians feel like $1 million. That's our job.
I totally agree.
And
because if they do, the piece soars.
Absolutely, yeah. It just sounds incredible when that does happen. And especially you have to kind of take the meta into account too. Like there's been a lot of gigs I've been on where it was live orchestra, but it was actually multiple composers. And you have to kind of look at the types of music that's being written, not just your music, but the music around you. So you can't be the person to say like, well, they just better figure it out, you can't really do that because suddenly your music is taking forever. You're eating up someone else's time.
Right.
And everyone's going to be pissed off at you, or they just don't finish your piece and they move on. And then it's like, crap. Now what?
And then it's on your shoulders.
Exactly.
It's not them.
And it's tough. So you have to think about what's the most, and Call of Duty actually kind of taught me this quite a bit, was like, what's the simplest way I can write this to get the exact same affect, but not be a huge pain in the ass?
I want to get to Call of Duty and Mortal Kombat in particular because but I will say I remember, you had this wonderful tour of duty, and I remember you going up on stage at the Game Audio Network Guild Awards and basically being like, I'm on stage winning an award for what's effectively my first shipped game as a composer. And I was like, that's fucking awesome. Because again, it was like, to me, you were that guy that blew my mind with his killer mock-up at GDC 6 or 7 years before that, or whatever it was, 5 years, something like that. I love to see like deserving people get what they're due. And that was one of those moments, but then it's only gotten better since. So, I remember we talked, you recorded me for a podcast I don't actually remember what happened with it, but we were outside of E3, with Kristen Nagus.
Yeah.
And cause I remember you were DICE Award nominated for the Temple of Osiris.
Oh yeah,
the Lara Croft game, because I remember that was another one of those where I heard it and I thought, I remember thinking, this guy, I've known this guy has talent, but what I love is that he's really proving it with this score, because this was clearly pulling a mountain out of a hat. Like, I don't know, I have no idea what budgets were and that sort of thing, but it was clear that you had gone several extra miles to make sure that this thing sounded bigger and more beautiful and more thoroughly conceived than surely what they were expecting to get. I just can't fathom otherwise. And so the fact that you get a DICE nomination for it was because it was like, I was like, probably half the people are going, "What the hell game is this?" But the score really spoke for itself.
No one told me about that DICE award, by the way. Like I had never even thought that we would have been eligible because it wasn't like a disc game,
right?
So I didn't realize that it was even possible. So I kind of wasn't paying attention. And then thankfully, and I'm very grateful, you were the one who texted me like, "Hey, congratulations on whatever," and I was like, "What?
Who is this? How did you get this number?"
I was like, "Huh? What?"
Yeah, well,
it was crazy.
I have a weird soft spot, even though it's funny because awards unto themselves, with all due respect to our DICE benefactors here on this wonderful, best podcast ever, awards have a certain, you have to take everything with a grain of salt, right? Because there's a certain amount of, the zeitgeist, what's kind of in right now, what's trending, what's all that goes into that, which composer has the little magical sparkle on them where it's just seemingly they can do no wrong for this month. And then the new flavor of the month comes. Yeah. We're all humans. We're tribal. We're social. We can't help it.
Yeah.
I do also believe the cream rises, and you look at like John Williams' has 51 Oscar nominations. Well, that's not exactly flavor of the month at that point. At some point you realize like he really is just quite good. And the Academy, the Oscar Academy, the Motion Picture Academy has acknowledged that 51 different occasions. And so that was one of those moments where the idealism of what the awards represent to me actually was on display, because it wasn't a giant AAA game that was dominating all the other categories also. It was like, no, here's a score. And in fairness, DICE, because it's this composer collective who decides it, it's people who are really plugged into what the community is doing in general, not just what's making the biggest headlines. Nonetheless, that was a great moment because I thought this is a hell of a score and it made me happy. But I also knew like the LucasArts thing, it's tough to get thrown out into the wilderness if you are used to a staff job. Jesse and I have talked about this as well. When you're in a mindset of like, I work Monday to Friday and I get weekends for me and maybe I'll write music with it or maybe I won't or whatever. It's very different to suddenly being like a small business owner, entrepreneur that suddenly has to go out and scrounge for every dollar. And so the Osiris thing was the first little glimpse that I saw, at least, that you were successfully pivoting. But what was that like for you, this shift into the wilderness?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't want to get too depressing, but I mean, when the whole thing went down, I knew for a fact that out of the 200-something people working at LucasArts, I would be the very last person to land on my feet.
What made you think that?
The reason being that, number one, audio is preposterously competitive as it is.
Right,
just
of course.
Absurdly. Number two, of audio compared to the rest of the industry, music, when compared to audio, is the same gap of like, this is preposterously difficult.
Yeah.
But then, I'm not the only musician at LucasArts. There's also Jesse Harlan.
Right.
And, whenever a studio kind of diaspora is like that, there's always a number of projects that, come up, like new studios get formed. And,
right.
Jesse kind of had positioned himself in such a way that, all of those people who had the wherewithal to start the new studios, they all kind of worked with him rather than me. So he pretty much, all of those gigs kind of went to him. And I saw that coming, and it wasn't, it wasn't a surprise, but it did mean that like, okay, well, I have to almost kind of start from square one.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is that I later realized that Star Wars music doesn't really translate to most of what's going on in games. It's sort of its own little bubble.
That is very true.
And, I had the First Assault score, but it wasn't really relevant to anything right away that, was out there. And, I would show people like, hey, check out this piece I did. And they'd be like, cool, give us something that isn't Star Wars,
Yeah, and something that's also not like $1 million production value budget.
Yeah,
literally, Abbey Road, London Symphony or whatever.
I know, yeah.
90% of games, even AAA games, are going to look at that and say,
cool,
so
sure,
next time I have $5 million burning a hole in my pocket, I'll call you.
Exactly, yeah.
So how'd you solve that? I mean, how did you...
Well, again, it wasn't like a quick fix thing. It was, like first of all, I really have to stress that while I was at Lucas, I did not at all treat it like a 9 to 5. I mean, I was constantly, I was doing gigs on the side, in film scoring as well, like indie film scoring.
Oh, cool.
Some of my friends from back in Philadelphia, they hit me up and stuff. I was working, we didn't mention this, and we don't have to go into any detail at all, but I am a sample library developer. Was at the time. I'm not anymore.
This is the Impact...
Impact Soundworks, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was working on some stuff for them while I was at Lucas and after. And I was also just generally, I acted as if I were the youngster trying to network, but really make a bunch of friends and just stay within the industry. I was kind of bothered by the insularity of a lot of in-house folks where they figured, well, I'm here and I have my sort of bubble here and that's perfectly fine for me. But I was never okay with that because I wanted to meet other people outside of just the LucasArts, fortress or whatever. So all throughout my entire time at Lucas, I would go to every GDC, all the meetups, everything, IGDA, everything I could get my hands on. Part because I was just fascinated by games and games development, not just the audio side, but all of it. And part because I kind of knew that I wanted to eventually be that, I wanted to be the Austin Wintory, the freelance composer who's really making it and whatnot. And I knew that... I
wouldn't wish that on anybody.
And I knew that, LucasArts kind of had this glass ceiling where I'm never going to kind of, pass that. So it's like, well, let's make sure that should I one day decide to leave, that I'm, not just starting from absolute square one. But yeah, I kept up with a lot of folks. Like, for example, Alex Wilmer, before he was at Crystal, we were friends because he was running Berkeley Sound something or another. He was like a post house over in Berkeley. And we became friends from a million years ago, GDC, and we, kept chatting. And then he got to Crystal Dynamics. He worked on Guardian of Light, which was the predecessor to Temple of Osiris. And I loved that game. And we would just talk about music implementation. He's actually, he's an audio director, but he's got brilliant insights on implementation of music. And we would just talk about stuff. He was working on the unannounced Tomb Raider game at the time, the reboot. And I was working on Force Unleashed 2. And we kind of got the same problems that we were trying to handle. We obviously couldn't tell each other what games we were working on, but it was similar situations of how do you have music be dynamic and not just bombard you all the time? Which at the time was what people expected. It was early, mid PS3 era. So fully dynamic music was still just that weird thing that Uncharted does, but no one else does.
It's funny how there's still these telltale signs of just literally a couple of years ago, such infancy, such hallmarks of infancy, where the music systems were so primitive compared to now. And I feel like 5 years from now, we would look back at this moment and say, how preposterous that we thought we knew what we were doing. It changes and it evolves so fast.
Yeah, we get less and less just the excuses for, just play a loop. Now it's that's unacceptable.
We can't get off the hook. I like that. I like that we
Absolutely,
can't get off the hook the way we used to, because I was always, even as a kid playing games, I was so used to the way movies were so elegant. There was no idea of, the dialogue scene ended and so the music just cuts.
Yeah.
That never happened in a film score. And so when I would turn and play a game, I would say, well, why did it just do that? That's very annoying.
Yeah.
And I know the piece has an end because, they had to have made, logically it must. I didn't, of course, it may not actually have if it was a MIDI-driven system, but it was one of those that I was always longing for that, but I found gamers in general didn't seem to care. It was
I think they did. It's just that the ones who didn't tended to be more of that conservative lot who, they just appreciated the content so much that the implementation wasn't necessarily a concern.
Yeah, that's true.
Which I totally respect. But remember, a lot of people used to mute their TVs back in the day, and they don't anymore. And I think that says something really good about the direction we've been going.
Yeah, for sure.
But Alex and I would talk about these things, and fast forward to, and this is while I was still at Lucas, but fast forward until now I'm, out and on my own. And I remember I had actually been working on Dead Island 2, which is a job I got off of a website, and I'm not kidding. Literally, they had on their website, we are looking for a composer, in parentheses, male or female, to work on Dead Island.
They said that in their post?
I think that's like a European Union thing or something. I don't know. It was real weird. It wasn't
That's
a post
hilarious.
either. It was just on the regular job site.
What an odd...
Yeah. You've never seen a composer position on a job site, I'm sure, on a...
I mean, I've never looked on sort of like LinkedIn style job, like monster.com kind of job
No, it's
sites,
not. It was on their the company website.
Oh, that I've never seen.
Yeah,
never even heard
that was
of
weird. Exactly.
That's like just begging for the piranha feeding frenzy. I mean,
that's a whole other story, but like...
Because I definitely got a lot of jobs when I first came out here to LA. There was, I think it still exists, there was a website called Mandy.com, which did like casting and crew calls, mostly for short films and stuff. And so I would just spend all day on there, and there would be people saying like, looking for a composer on my 9-minute short film or whatever. But I was the guy that I would see the casting calls, and I would see the looking for cinematographer and I'd go, well, they're going to need a composer eventually. So I would just email everybody, and I did 1 billion short films that way. But a couple things came out of it that were actually really cool out of the 1,000. But the idea of a proper job listing, especially because they weren't looking for a staff. Like they were,
it was still a
they had a
contractor.
listing for a freelance position. That's even more weird.
It was very strange.
Male or female.
That they just put that on all M/F.
That's funny.
But or maybe I'm misinterpreting, but it said M/F, which I assume, I don't know, maybe that means something. I don't know. It was real weird.
Well, I don't know.
Real weird, but
it didn't also specify like age, height, and measurements and other very creepy things.
You must be able to bench press this one.
Well, that's one area where you would succeed.
Finally.
We're going to get to that.
Finally.
You're the only
long story short,
champion deadlifter.
I had been working on Dead Island, and I designed the interactive music system. And I expected, I set out a tech roadmap, and I expected, okay, maybe in a month or two we'll get... I went to Berlin for 1 week, and our engineers had it up and running. And I was so proud of them. The game had been announced, but we were still kind of working on this stuff. And I just made some offhand Facebook posts kind of bragging on their behalf because we were like pretty chummy and stuff. Alex saw the Facebook post, and he knew he was working on Temple of Osiris. Originally, their budget for music was $0.
Wow.
Like zero for like literally we're just reused music from previous Tomb Raider games because that's what they did on Guardian of Light. But he saw that and he realized, oh, well, this guy can probably write in the Tomb Raider style. And if he has this implementation chops, maybe we can get him in as an implementer and then pay him, however many extra thousands for writing the score. And that's how we'll get more than a $0 budget for this game. Because he was already working on Rise of the Tomb Raider. And it was like just so much going on that there was no way for him to implement the whole game on his own. He just gave me a suspicious phone call like, hey man, could you send me a demo piece in like an ancient sort of sounding style that maybe would sound appropriate for such a game, And I sent him that, and he hired me. And
a coffin investigator,
something
along those lines.
Mausoleum,
yes, mausoleum tourist
up, or I don't know. But yeah, it went from there. They gave me a PC because I also lived in the Bay Area, so I could just log into their network and behave exactly like an on-site employee. I could implement music however I wanted, which was great. I could do things like play the game without any cheats or god modes and tell, oh, I'm really getting stuck in this area. Maybe if I put a new piece of music there or like go off and write something, just so that the players aren't discouraged, but like so they have some, like it's almost like the game acknowledges this is hard. It's okay if it takes you a little bit of time, And always hear.
It's funny how I usually do the opposite. If there's an area, I tend to be reductive. If I think someone's going to get stuck, I try to lower the stimulus. So it's an interesting idea of like almost like an Easter egg.
Well, music is a reward in and of itself, I think.
It's totally true.
When you hear the same thing over and over, that's like, but any kind of change in the music is like, okay, we're acknowledging that this is not, some mindless puzzle like you've done for the past 2 rooms, but here it's like you really got to put on your thinking cap. But anyway, so yeah, I designed the music system for that and implemented most of it. and I got to write the score that I wanted, and it felt so great, like taking the handcuffs of what would Johnny do off, and then being able to use a piano wherever I wanted, or like, you know, use whatever choir I want, you know, little things that you're just not allowed to do in Star Wars.
I can just totally picture you getting all excited, and they're like, so our biggest inspiration is going to be probably Indiana Jones. You're like, God damn it.
No, that came from me, actually.
Really?
Because, the game sounds very much like Indiana Jones. Because
I mean, I say that jokingly because it doesn't feel derivative to me at all.
Well, I did some cues. Definitely, I skewed towards that, and the reason why was because I wanted to separate it as much as possible. So Jason Graves wrote a beautiful score for the reboot Tomb Raider game, and it's almost like Tomb Raider up until that point had been going in one direction, and the reboot took it in this very documentary Hollywood style. And I was like, well, what's the exact opposite of that? And I thought, like, it's got to sound like this, like, really fun, epic Saturday morning cartoon, kind of like energetic, because the action's so helter-skelter, and it's like 4-player multiplayer, and there's like a cajillion enemies at any given time. So that's how the kind of Indiana Jones, Goldsmith the Mummy kind of stuff came in. It's much more busy than a Tomb Raider score usually is. But it just felt so liberating to be able to, you know, just write the notes that I wanted and not have to ask what would someone else do, but instead it's like, well, this is what I want to do. And
well, it's you going back to what being a composer always was.
Yeah,
I mean, you were never in that frame of mind until the LucasArts time, right? I assume.
That's true. Yeah.
So you were just sort of getting back to that place, your comfort place, or the place that all composers really ought to live. You know, it's not a good default state to kind of have to think, does this match the branding of some other composer?
Yeah.
Even though that can be a good gig. But it's funny, actually, to that end, I'm perpetually in awe of Gordy, because I remember when EA was looking for a composer on Battlegrounds, I had a conversation with my agent about it. You know, we got wind of it, and I said, I don't know. I said, if they're just looking for a first-rate, second-rate John Williams, I don't think I can be that guy. Also, that sounds like a horrible job. That's very unappealing. Like, I don't think I'm up for that. And I remember I just kind of, and then when I heard what he did, when I heard he got the job, I was like, oh, I don't envy him. And then I listened to it, and I was like, holy shit. He actually found a way to do this with incredible artistry and class and elegance and real. I told him, this doesn't sound like John Williams. This is like John Williams in the 80s when he was on fire. Like, this is the best of what Star Wars can be. It's not just more to the pile.
You know, what I always loved about Gordy's Star Wars scores, and this goes from Old Republic until the most recent Battlefront, you can totally tell that he's still having so much fun with it. And that mentality is kind of what I tried to bring to Vader Immortal, the Star Wars Vader Immortal. You know, I scored that at exactly the same time as Mortal Kombat. For unfortunate scheduling reasons that just happened. I won't name names, but one of the games like stayed to its deadlines like a rock. The other did not. And so, you know, I ended up having to finish them both on the same exact day. You know, it was one of those
literal same day,
wow. Monday. So I got the weekend to write however many, like 20 minutes, some crazy. But I just remember going from MK, which was some of the most fun I've ever had working in game music and anything. But then going to Star Wars, it just still felt like there was so much more fun to be had. Like, it still felt like working on this Star Wars thing, even though it wasn't completely me, it still felt like there's just such a joy of working with the orchestra that way that you can't really get anywhere else other than like a very pure sort of style. And obviously my MK score is about as impure as it gets. It's got world instruments, synthesizers, everything out there. Whereas, you know, Vader, it was much more like, let's embrace the purity and complexity of the orchestra and kind of do that same thing of like, everyone's having fun and it's like a party, you know, going into it.
Oh, for sure.
And, you know, I think in doing that, I kind of understand how Gordy's able to do, but maybe this is like his 5th Star Wars game or whatever.
Oh, I think at this point he may have I think he's actually written more Star Wars music than John Williams.
Yeah, surprising many people have actually. It's kind of crazy.
Well, that may be true. I guess that's not as much.
Kevin
of a
Kiner, I think, has the record. Right
well,
now.
that's true. Yeah, years of scoring shows.
Yeah.
But this is like London recording full on Star Wars.
Yeah,
it's not TV budget Star Wars. I mean, no disrespect to Kevin Kiner, but like that, all those Star Wars Battlefront scores are outrageous. And now there's another 6 or 7 or 8 hours or whatever in the new one.
Yeah, and he's working with Stephen Bart. I'm really looking forward to that.
Oh my God,
really
me too.
Cool.
As
I
a
love
Dark
Stephen
Forces
Barton's music. It's going to be really interesting stuff.
I remember I've been dying with curiosity because he's not the guy I would have thought of. He's so wired for technology. He's such this like futurist. He's extremely, and Star Wars is so almost anti that. There's not a synthesizer in sight anywhere in the John Williams aesthetic.
He has synthesizers.
I was just going to say, this is where you're going to tell me I'm wrong.
Well, I don't mean
Please.
to.
No, I'm ready, man.
He uses tons of synthesizers in Star Wars and any
Where?
other he does a lot of like, hey, here's my like synth strings so what's the. Like they go to episode 1, they go to Coruscant, just for example, and like it's got that beautiful fanfare. I don't want to sing it because I'll sound like an idiot on these microphones. But anyways, so he doubles the live strings with like a synth strings thing that's almost doing the same thing, but like more keyboardishly. Zam the Assassin, there's tons of like electric guitar solos in that.
Yeah, sure.
Tons of synthesizer in
I guess
and the Empire Strikes Back. He even does like a Hans Zimmer sort of thumping bass in Crystal Skull. He uses synthesizers quite a lot.
More recently, yes, that I can acknowledge.
Empire Strikes Back.
Empire is the big shocker.
The tree. When he goes into the evil tree or whatever. That's all synth.
The evil tree. The
Whatever,
Yoda
tree. You don't remember that?
Yeah, I just think of it as, I'll have to go back and re-listen. You're exposing
it's a
potential
very
ignorance
overt
here.
kind of like Moog synth kind of lead type thing.
I have to go back and re-listen. I can't. My mental inner mind's ear is not calling that one up and hearing anything other than the very traditional orchestra. Well, all right. You've learned.
This
is great. I love it. Being shown to be wrong is amazing because you're not wrong anymore. It's a beautiful moment. So I don't want to gloss past Call of Duty because we keep dangling Mortal Kombat out in front of the ears of whoever's listening to this. And I really loved what you did there. And it was
thank you so much.
It was so like fun. It was so like I'm just gonna go crazy, and I loved that about it. Even just the video presentation of the theme of bouncing back and forth between we've got orchestra over here and Doug Perry over here, and like just having fun with musicians, and it felt very you because it had all the polish and sort of technical knowledge that I know you have, but I also know you're just a guy that loves to make music. Again, I think of all those MagFest photos I would always see of hotel room jams with you playing your flute or whatever. And so it felt like this is the score he was sort of built to write in so many respects. And that is a pretty impressive feat considering that just a year or two earlier, there was this explosion in the form of Call of Duty, where the franchise goes back to World War II for the first time in ages. And that's obviously pretty famous territory within our world because that's where Michael Giacchino cut his teeth and became, that's where starting in that world and then becoming one of the most in-demand Hollywood composers on the planet with, Medal of Honor and Call of Duty as his leaping off point.
Yeah.
So it's fairly hallowed grounds. But at the same time, it has become so dominated by a very kind of Hollywood, like Sarah Schachner's been crushing it. And Jack Wall, in the opposite of what Giacchino did, like the front lines of the coolest sounding textural synth, just like cranked to the max, crazy orchestral elements all compressed to high hell, and it's hip and fucking awesome. And you did almost dogmatically the opposite of all that. And I remember when I heard it, I was like, this is so exciting. to hear like raw performance, but it's not John Williams-y or anything like that. But it's like get to hear this music. So just walk us through some of that, at least. Tell us, about, because I don't want to go on for 7 more hours. But I just remember it was such an impressive score, and you got a lot of love very righteously for it. And I just would love to hear more of where'd it come from. Did you have to sell them on that approach? Was that what they wanted you to do? Just kind of give us some of the story.
Yeah, I don't know where. I mean, I'll start sort of towards the end. Very quick anecdote. So we're in the second recording session. And, it's a recording session, so sometimes maybe the music director will invite like their local friend. We recorded in Nashville.
Yeah.
And so, someone's coming in. The game was announced, so it's like, hey, come in, check out this Call of Duty recording session. But we happened to be scoring this one piece that's just a viola solo. It's a piece called Berga, where they go to a work camp in the game. And it's very somber. It's pretty much just repeating piano. It's just a piano minor arpeggio for the entire piece, and then a very slow, somber viola solo. And the orchestra kind of hums in a little bit, but extremely quietly. And,
not a very showy recording.
It's like the opposite of what you would ever expect. And this guy walked in, and he was so nervous because he was like, oh, crap. Did I come in the wrong session? Like, you would never have thought that this was a Call of Duty session. And then eventually the music director saw him in the corner. He's like, no, come on. It's the right one. Yeah. But, I mean, that's what it felt like. It didn't feel like this was... There was like a weird disconnect between me scoring this and literally everything I'd done before. I'd done all these fantasies, sci-fi, Star Wars, Lara Croft, and even Dead Island, which was like super left field. That was all California rock music, believe it or not. But, here comes Call of Duty. I didn't know what game it was before they, hired me proper, and they said, hey, okay, yeah, we're going to just hire you. It's a World War II game. And
meaning like you had to demo blindly? Or...
I didn't demo at all.
So they just offered it, but you didn't know what they were offering?
Pretty much, yeah.
Well, that's odd. Never heard of that.
We had been kind of talking back and forth. And I guess what my demo actually was I showed them some of the Star Wars First Assault score.
Oh, finally.
And the thing about, so I told you it would eventually come around. And the thing about First Assault was that it was a story about rebels and Imperial foot soldiers. It wasn't about Jedi and Sith, but it was about real people.
Yeah.
And the idea was like, imagine Star Wars is a sculpture, and it's always been filmed from this angle. But what if we film it from like over here?
Right.
What about the regular Joe Schmoes who don't
That's what Rogue One aspired to as well.
Exactly, like, It was
get off this main path of fate of the universe characters.
Absolutely, yeah. And, how do we make it real? And part of that was, well, if they're just regular people, then the Imperials aren't evil at all.
Right.
They're just, military. They have, these aspirations of bringing peace to the galaxy, and that this is how they want to do it. They're doing their service. And I kind of sort of took that mentality and brought it as much as I could into the music. So like the main theme for it, for example, I mean, it has my own melody, but then it also references the Imperial March in a major key to show that this is what they're using as, like a army strong kind of, rah, we're brave, we're Imperial soldiers. And I think that and then I also had, a lot of more emotional pieces within the score as well. And I think they saw that and they were like, this is exactly what we want to bring to Call of Duty. It's no longer the super soldiers with the wall jumping and jetpacks and stuff. It's just regular people.
Right.
And when you play the game, you forget
not
that
even regular people. They're like, because one of the things that I loved about the game was it with these flashbacks to home, where it was like they weren't even just normal people. They're essentially kids.
Yeah,
they're like 19-year-old.
Absolutely,
off of a farm.
Very vulnerable, very relatable. And that's what they wanted from the game. They wanted to pull the camera in really close and make sure that everyone seems as human as possible and not just these grandiose figures like we've been using. And that was my, direction from the start. We didn't actually even have any reference music either, which frustrated me to no end. I mean, I would go to bed crying every night thinking like, I'm going to get fired. Oh gosh, just tell me what you want. Because they were rejecting everything I wrote like left and right for a little while. But
really?
It took about a month for us to settle on the main theme. And I did three complete rewrites and then a bunch of revisions to that, and like 2 pages of MS Excel single spaced of like notes on the final one.
What do you think was the disconnect, or what were you targeting versus what were they?
Well, it wasn't targeting? Really obvious. I mean, music direction is one of those ephemeral things where sometimes you just don't know it until you see it. And we were all in the same boat. I mean, if they knew what they wanted, they would have sent me reference tracks, but they didn't really. They couldn't figure it out, and I couldn't figure it out until we saw it.
So it wasn't so much that they were rejecting it as it is you were mutually exploring.
Yeah.
Would you say that you also felt like this isn't it?
No, every single time I wrote something, I thought, this is perfect.
There's
no way that they're going to reject this. And then they're like, nah. And, I'm like, oh, gosh, okay, well, let's try something again. Okay, there's no way. Nah, it kind of went from there.
I know that feeling very well.
But, it's eventually we settled on something that kind of ignited this spark about this is an angle that we really wouldn't have even considered before, but it's exactly where we need to be. It's it oscillated between like too epic and then also too impersonal. So it's like, imagine one of them was too much like if we were doing a World War II game in like 1998 or something,
right?
With like 98 graphics, and it's just all like fun, rah, rah, rah shooting.
Yeah.
And then the other was too much like, okay, we're doing a History Channel documentary on the entire World War II.
Right.
And that's like, well, okay, cool, nice vibe, but it's not personal.
Right.
And where we figured it out was like, and this applies to the whole score, which is why it was so freaking hard to write. We always had to dance around this very careful tightrope of it's real and it's visceral, but it's human beings and they're very vulnerable and they're not super at all. But in a way they are, because they're heroes given what they're accomplishing as individuals that are vulnerable and whatnot. So that's kind of where that whole, the Call of Duty theme comes from. Is that like, yeah, they are, just 19-year-old kids being shipped off to a foreign land they've never been to before and told like, hey, yeah, just keep running forward and don't mind the bullets that are taking off your friends' limbs and stuff.
And
but
then
despite
kill
all
someone.
that, but despite all that, they still managed to get the job done. And that's kind of where we settled, and that's the direction that the music took for the whole thing.
What would you say? Because obviously that was a big ship to steer. How much music was it in the end? It was a bunch, wasn't it?
100 minutes, something like that.
Oh, I thought that's actually...
Well, 100 minutes that I wrote, but then it was the Sony PlayStation music team that kind of took all of my stems and then stretched that out to like 8 hours or some crazy thing like that.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. 100's actually pretty reasonable. Still, quite an escalation from Osiris. Did you, other than just the creative disconnect and the fear of being fired, were there any? Because you're kind of in a full-fledged producer mode also in that you got to manage all these, you got to track all these cues, version numbers. You start prepping orchestration and copying teams and all that kind of stuff. Did you feel qualified going into doing all that, or was it trial by fire?
For better or for worse, I didn't really do as much, I don't think, as you're probably imagining. Like on other games, yeah, I handled like pretty much everything, but on this, the Sony team kind of absorbed a lot of the production type stuff. Like
that is their specialty.
Yeah, like I obviously now definitely am glad with all the decisions that they've made, but like. I didn't know the orchestrator before I'd started that project. Wow. I'd never met David Ships, and so I was sort of like, "You're just telling me I have to, use this new person that I never heard of? Huh, that's weird."
It's a pretty intimate relationship to impose on somebody.
It is, yeah. But I mean, David Ships obviously ended up being amazing, and I've worked with him on almost everything ever since. That's obviously turned out really well.
Yeah.
But yeah, Sony team kind of absorbed most of those kind of management stuff, and in a way that was great because I could focus on just the writing of the music. Obviously I'm huge on music tech and implementation, so it was a little bit of a bummer that I had no insight into that world.
And you weren't able to weigh in or play test and give feedback or anything?
Unfortunately, no.
It can be hard, especially on a game of that scale. Was it a technical thing? Because in my experience, they're open to it. It's just difficult to figure out how to facilitate it.
I mean, it was a timing thing. So the other part of it is that for various reasons, I was hired like way later than anyone wanted me to be hired for it. So I had about half the time that you'd normally get for a COD game. I had only about 6 months or something like that. And then when you take that like 1 month out of it completely just for the main theme to make sure that everything is like started off right, then it's like 5 months to do 100 or something minutes. So it was not terribly easy to kind of...
Yeah, understood. Well, so then how do we go from Call of Duty, the vulnerable child sent off to a foreign land to fight war, to, Sub-Zero pulling a spine out of... What was that leap like for you? And am I projecting... that you seemed uniquely, perfectly wired to score that game, or did you feel like I am here where I belong?
So first off, I mean, I was a Mortal Kombat fan ever since middle school. It's my first video game, actually.
Wow!
And it got me into video games and into the martial arts, and I also like every note of that MK3 soundtrack I had memorized. I mean, I was playing this game nonstop. And I loved the first movie, and I was so in love with MK, and it kind of went away after a while, and I just focused on other fighting games. But MK came back with a vengeance in Mortal Kombat 9, the PlayStation 3 reboot, and they've just been knocking it out of the park. And as luck would have it, one of the Call of Duty sound designers actually used to work at NetherRealm on Mortal Kombat X. So I had him introduce me to the audio director, and it turned out that audio director had played Temple of Osiris.
Wow.
And also went to my GDC lecture on how I did the production on the music and stuff. And so he was like, yeah, actually, we're working on the next thing now. Let's do a demo thing. And it kind of just went from there. The demo I wrote for that is basically note for note the main theme. I only added 5 notes to the final version of the main theme. Otherwise, it's exactly as the demo was.
It's funny how that doesn't surprise me, because it feels like it, and the fact that you have this long history with it. Again, I'm very possibly guilty of projecting, but it does feel like you can sense that, because it's coming from a place of, I know this playground. I know where the boundaries are. I know what I can bring in that's sort of smuggling in the outside world, and yet I also understand what natively it sort of needs. And it's nowhere near as restrictive, I would say, as Star Wars or something. Like, at least intuitively to me, as an outsider, it doesn't seem like it.
I mean, if I were to like play the strengths and weaknesses game, I think that it's very weird that I was able to do Call of Duty, because I think that's a very intentionally monochromatic game, and that's not soundtrack, and that's not normally how I write. I like taking influences from everywhere and not using them even as intended, but just like, I like this sound, I'm going to use that sound, and that's all there is to it. And because I'm pretty sure Mortal Kombat is the only fighting game that has like a full-on story-based thing like this. It just worked really well. That mentality worked really well with it. I mean, it's a game with like, 30-something characters. And it's also a universe where you can be like a police officer or an actual literal god or a Chinese ninja. And somehow violently fighting each other. They're all on the same team. And it's like, what? And some of them are undead. It's like, it's so preposterous that you need this sort of
trip.
Exactly. Yeah. You need this sort of diversity to the score. It's the only, and I'm being facetious, but then I'm like, behind every joke is like a little bit of truth. It's like the only score I've ever done where I felt like they made the right call hiring me. Like the whole time.
Well, so that's essentially what I was saying.
The whole time I was working on it, I was like, yeah, you guys should have hired me.
Did you call them once a week and have stand-up meetings and say, guys, I just got to congratulate you. This was an inspired choice.
Yeah, well, maybe not so much, but
that was smart of you.
Even as I was writing it, I knew like this is the most fun I've ever had working on a game.
That's well, it showed. The work really. There's one last thing I want to ask you about, because I think composers in particular, because of the nature of freelance, where we are entrepreneurs who basically have to work, all day, 7 days a week, 90, 100, 200 hours a week. I remember seeing on Shark Tank, Lori Greiner said, entrepreneurs work 90 hours a week to avoid working 40 hours a week. And I thought
Nice.
that's the most perfect sentence I've ever heard in my life. And but because that's such a known thing, I think, of our community, at least within our community, that's such a known thing, that it can be a grind, that it can be very all-consuming. And so I'm always very curious what composers in particular like to do to get themselves out of their studio. I've got some friends that are just like diehard, wine lovers. That's like they know everything about wine, and that's their big kind of cathartic outlet. Or someone like Gordy, we talked about, he's a tennis fanatic. He plays tennis all the time, and like he not long ago injured his ankle, and he had to be off of his. Oh, no. He had to be off of the tennis court for like 2 months or something, and it was a big lifestyle change for him. And so I'm curious, because you're without a doubt the most sort of physically built composer that I know. You log serious time in the gym, and you seem to really put time and focus into not just I show up, I do my reps because I want to stay healthy, but it's like a focused. I have weight, goals, and or however you structure it. And you share that stuff online, and it's inspiring. As I sit here like drinking my coffee and sitting in my studio, I'm like, good for him, and then I don't get out of my chair. But it's that form of inspiring. But I'm just curious, because everyone has kind of their thing that's not related to, or they should hopefully have a thing that's not related to music, but lets them sort of center themselves. Is that what it represents for you, or am I just talking out of my ass here?
I guess. I mean, it's just sort of.
I love how at best I'm like 70% right with my guesses with you.
It could be, yeah. I mean, honestly, I don't even think of it that way. It's just sort of what you're probably referencing. So this year I had a personal goal, I guess New Year's resolution, if you want to call it that, of like I wanted to finally deadlift 500 pounds, and recently I got up to 495. Didn't think I could do it, by the way, which is why I didn't post video, because I was like, well, this is probably not going to end well, but let's just try. But I did it, and it's
severed spine.
Yeah, arms fall off as I.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, it's just nice to. I mean, on the one hand, yeah, it's nice to not be in the studio, but the reality is we're going to have days where you like barely have time to shower. You're just like writing, or whatever it is that you're doing in your job. And there's a lot of stuff that we do in our job, by the way, that has almost nothing to do with writing, but it just still takes up so much time.
Sometimes I just feel like I'm a professional email answerer.
Oh yeah. And so much stuff. And it can get so chaotic at the end of a project that if you haven't built up a level of like just physical health, then it's going to tank so badly by the end that you're, what are you left with? There's a very famous, it's so funny, like I'm remembering this. There's a very famous Japanese classic game composer, Hiroki Kikuta. He did like the Secret of Mana series. And he once went to MagFest, which is this like game convention, and he did like a Q&A or whatever. And I asked him at the Q&A, like, how do you start a score? What do you do when you first get the assignment for whatever score? I think he was in-house at Square Enix or something like that. How do you start? And I'm expecting like a technical answer. I don't know what I was working on at the time, but I was definitely flustered a little bit by something. Maybe I was starting off on First Assault or something like that. And his answer was like, oh, I work out 5 days a week. I'm like, what do you mean? It's like, no, I amp up the physical, like training and whatever at the start of the project when there's time to do that, because inevitably you're going to be so stressed for time and just stressed generally that you won't be able to, lift or do anything. And that'll kind of get you into this mental state where you're like sluggish, you're like thinking slower.
Does it actually help with inspiration though at the start? Because sometimes doing something to take your mind off the thing,
it could be,
gets your mind actually working.
It absolutely could be. I'm not sure. I mean, for me, it is actually helpful because I have like my I want to say iPod. Obviously, nobody has an iPod anymore. You know what I mean? And it's on like a big shuffle of like everything. So I have no idea what music is going to come next. And I'm focused on other stuff, but maybe I'll hear something and it's like, that would be interesting for this game. So maybe I'll, take notes or something on that. I use like Trello, which is like this online note-taking thing. And I'll just be like, hey, listen to this piece or listen to this like, new metal song or like whatever. And, check it out when you're working on such and such and pay attention to this, that, and the other. It's been super helpful. And it's great for kind of getting another perspective that wouldn't maybe be so obvious. I can't imagine that I would have been able to do Mortal Kombat without that influence because it's so diverse. And I'm pretty sure that some of that is because like, maybe after Erykah Badu played, suddenly like a Slavic choir showed up in my shuffle or whatever. And it's like, oh, wait, this disconnect. Okay, there's something there. Maybe I'll take this down and make note of that moment or something.
Yeah, interesting. I did not expect that at all. I thought it was going to be so much about this the focus, the discipline on the physical side of it, and not even
nothing. I mean, maybe subconsciously, but it's not. I love it. Yeah,
it's funny how I feel like if I go back and listen to this whole conversation, the things I expected you to have this very intellectualized answer for, you were kind of like, I don't know, maybe, and then the stuff that I just off the cuff am talking about, you're like, well, actually, here's exactly how that is. And that's very cool. It was very unexpected.
Give people what they want, but not the way that they know.
That is truer words never spoken. Well, hopefully we've done that here today. Really, really awesome, man. Really appreciate you walking through all this. I'm sure we could have spent. I would love to ask more about particularly both Call of Duty and Mortal Kombat because they're such. What I love is that they're both such declarations of you. They're not, they're not, which Osiris was as well, but understandably with the kind of caveats and the pulling the mountain out of a hat. But those were like, you give me some of the string to build a rope, and I can fashion something really quite monumental. And it's very exciting because there's a lot of craft to this work. There's a lot of, here's, the violins do this, the drums do this. We want a functional piece of work. And both of those said, that's not satisfying. I think we can do better than that. And we can, especially because in both cases, these are storied franchises that have a long history and a lot of supposed right and wrong about how to approach them. And you managed to dodge all the cliches and inject something new, and I'm glad we got to talk about it. So
thank you so much for having me.
No, man, it's a real pleasure. I look forward to whatever top secret things are currently sleep depriving you, and I know this will come out sometime down the road, mysteriously into the future when we get the magical word from our friends at DICE. But as of the time of recording this, we are on the eve of your keynote address for Game Sound Con here in LA. So I think I should let you go and probably write your keynote address if you're anything like any other composers, myself included.
Yeah.
So for those betwixt and all a Twitter under your spell, how can we find you online and social media and stuff?
Well, you can find me on a Twitter at WILBERT ROGET at Wilbert Roget. Also rogetmusic.com, ROGETmusic.com.
Well, thank you, sir.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for the Game Maker's Notebook. For more information on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, our podcasts, and our other initiatives, please visit www.interactive.org.